Story by Aaron Bones in the Night. We were 4 days into the desert trek when we found them. A graveyard of bones stretching out across the dunes like a pale, shattered forest. The skeletons were old, bleached by the sun and polished smooth by the wind. At first, we thought they belonged to animals, maybe the remains of some ancient migration. But as we got closer, we realized the truth. They were human. Hundreds, maybe thousands of skeletons lay scattered across the sand, their bones tangled together as if they had been thrown into the desert by some violent force. Skulls grinned up at us, their empty sockets staring at nothing. Some were still clutching the rusted remnants of weapons, shields, and tools. "I don't like this," Mila muttered, wrapping her scarf tighter around her face. "We should move on." But Harris, always the curious one, crouched down to examine a rib cage half buried in the sand. "This is incredible," he said, brushing sand away with trembling hands. "It's like they all died at once. But there's no sign of a battle. No weapons marks, no signs of decay. What killed them then?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted an answer. That night, we camped near the edge of the graveyard. The dunes were eerily quiet, the wind carrying none of its usual whispers. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the bones shifting, rattling in the darkness, trying to pull themselves together. Around midnight, I heard the first sound, a soft, hollow clinking, like dry wood knocking together. I sat up, heart pounding, and peered into the darkness. The desert stretched out before me, vast and empty. But the sound grew louder. Clink, clink, clink. I shook Mila awake. "Do you hear that?" She blinked at me, groggy and irritated. "What?" The sound exploded into a cacophony. The clinking became clattering, a frantic, rattling noise that seemed to come from every direction. Harris was already on his feet, shining his flashlight toward the graveyard. The bones were moving. I'll never forget the sight. Skeletons that had been scattered and broken hours earlier were pulling themselves together, their pieces snapping into place with unnatural speed. Skulls leapt onto spines, ribs knit themselves to sternums, fingers crawled like spiders to join hands. One by one, they rose. "Run!" Harris shouted. But the desert had other plans. The sand shifted beneath our feet, dragging us toward the skeletal horde. I stumbled, falling to my knees, as one of the skeletons turned its eyeless gaze toward me. It moved in jerky, unnatural strides, its jaw opening and closing like it was trying to speak. The others came alive, their movements growing more fluid, more human. They were assembling themselves into monstrous shapes, two skeletons melding into one, or three sets of ribs forming a grotesque, multi-limbed torso. They didn't just want to be whole. They wanted to be more. I grabbed Mila's arm and pulled her to her feet. Harris wasn't so lucky. He froze as a skeletal hand wrapped around his ankle, dragging him to the ground. "Help me!" he screamed. But the bones swarmed him, their sharp edges slicing into his skin. His screams stopped abruptly as a rib pierced his throat. Mila and I ran. We didn't know where we were going, just away. The clattering followed us, growing louder, closer. The ground beneath us felt alive, shifting and moving as though the desert itself was trying to trap us. When we finally collapsed, gasping for breath, the noise had stopped. The skeletons were gone, vanished into the dunes as though they had never been there. But the graveyard was different now. The bones were no longer scattered. They had arranged themselves into intricate patterns, circles within circles, spirals and lines, all converging on a single point, the place where Harris had fallen. We didn't sleep that night. We didn't dare. By morning, the patterns were gone, swallowed by the sand. But something had changed. The desert felt heavier, darker. And every time the wind blew, I could hear the faint rattle of bones carried on the breeze. We left the desert as quickly as we could, but the sound followed us. Even now, back in the safety of the city, I hear it in the quiet moments, soft clinks and clatters, like a warning. I don't know what the skeletons were building, or why they let us go, but I know one thing for certain. The desert doesn't forget. Story by Bert, the Mirage that never ends. I was lost when I first saw it, staggering through the dunes with cracked lips and sunburned skin. The desert had swallowed my caravan 3 days ago, leaving me the only survivor. My water was gone, my hope with it. All I could think about was the unbearable thirst clawing at my throat. Then I saw it. An oasis shimmering on the horizon, a pool of clear water surrounded by lush palms. I blinked, sure it was a trick of the heat, a mirage like the others I'd chased. But it didn't fade. It seemed more solid, more real with every step I took. Desperation drove me forward. The ground beneath me shifted from scorching sand to cool, damp earth. I fell to my knees at the water's edge, scooping it into my mouth with trembling hands. It was sweet, cold, the most refreshing thing I'd ever tasted. For the first time in days, I felt alive. The oasis was perfect. The water was endless, the fruit from the trees abundant. I told myself I would rest, gather my strength, and leave when I was ready. But as the days turned into weeks, something began to feel off. The first clue was the sun. It never set. Time didn't move here, not really. The light never dimmed. The shadows never shifted. I tried to count the hours, but I quickly lost track. It felt like I'd been there forever, yet no time had passed. And then there was the stillness. There were no birds, no insects, no sounds except for the rustling of the palm fronds in a wind I couldn't feel. Even the water didn't ripple when I touched it. It was on the 3rd, or was it the 30th, day that I noticed something I couldn't explain. My footprints in the sand hadn't faded. They led from the edge of the oasis back into the desert, exactly where I'd first arrived. They should have been erased by the wind long ago, but there was no wind. I tried to leave that day. I packed what little food I could carry and walked back into the dunes. The heat was brutal, the sun oppressive, but I kept going, glancing back only once. The oasis was still there, impossibly close, as though I hadn't traveled at all. When I turned back toward the desert, the dunes looked different. They were taller now, steeper, their curves sharp and unnatural. The landscape felt unfamiliar, alien. I walked for hours, or maybe days, until I saw it again. The oasis. It was exactly as I'd left it, untouched, pristine. My footprints led back to the same spot on the water's edge. I tried again and again to escape, taking different directions, but the result was always the same. The dunes shifted, folding in on themselves like waves, leading me back to the oasis. I screamed into the endless sky, tearing at my hair, but no one heard me. No one was here but me. Time began to twist. I no longer knew how long I'd been trapped. The reflection in the water grew strange, the face staring back at me unfamiliar. My skin was too pale, my eyes too wide, my lips too thin. I was changing, but I didn't know into what. Then the voices started. They came from the water, soft at first, whispering promises of salvation. "Drink," they said. "You'll never be thirsty again. You'll never be hungry. You'll never die." I fought the temptation, but the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, until I couldn't ignore them. The last thing I remember is kneeling by the water's edge, my reflection grinning at me while I cried. I don't know who or what I am now. I don't feel hunger or thirst or the passage of time. My body is weightless, my mind hazy, but I can't leave. I'm part of the oasis now, bound to it, just like the whispers that lured me in. Sometimes, travelers pass by, lost and desperate. I try to warn them, but my voice is no longer my own. It's the same voice that called me here, promising rest and relief. They never listen, just like I didn't. And when they drink from the water, I watch as their faces change, becoming reflections of my own. The oasis always has room for more. Story by Job, the Lost City Beneath the Sands. They had called it a myth, a fairy tale for dreamers and treasure hunters. But when the first reports of ancient ruins peeking out of the shifting sands reached us, we couldn't resist. I was part of the expedition sent to find it, the fabled lost city buried centuries ago by a sandstorm, so powerful it wiped an entire civilization from existence. We arrived after weeks of traveling across the unrelenting dunes. The first sign of the city was a single spire, jagged and worn by time, jutting out of the sand like a broken tooth. It was silent, unmoving, but even as I looked at it, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching us. The excavation began the next morning. Shovels in hand, we dug through the soft, golden grains, the sun blistering above us. Piece by piece, the city revealed itself. A cracked stone archway here, fragments of walls there. By the end of the first day, we had uncovered what appeared to be a courtyard, its stones intricately carved with symbols none of us could recognize. That night, the dream started. I woke gasping, the taste of sand in my mouth. I couldn't remember much of the dream, only fleeting images. A woman's face shrouded in a veil, her hollow eyes staring into mine. The sound of distant wailing, like a mournful wind, and a heavy weight pressing against my chest, as though the very sand was trying to crush me. I wasn't the only one. The others were pale, jittery, whispering among themselves about visions, shadows, and voices that seemed to come from the very ground. One of them, Malik, swore he heard singing when he placed his ear to the stones in the courtyard. We should have left then, but the lure of discovery was too strong. By the third day, we'd uncovered a massive staircase leading down into the earth. The air that rose from below was cool, damp, and carried the faint scent of decay. Against our better judgment, we descended. The city beneath the sand was enormous, a sprawling labyrinth of tunnels and chambers carved directly into the rock. Our torches barely illuminated the high ceilings, where carvings of twisted, elongated figures loomed above us. The walls seemed to shimmer, as though they were sweating, and our footsteps echoed endlessly. As we explored deeper, the whispers began. At first, I thought they were echoes of our own voices, bouncing off the cavernous walls. But as the hours dragged on, the whispers grew distinct, words spoken in a language I didn't understand but somehow felt in my bones. They called to me, urged me forward. That's when we found the first skeletons. They were huddled in corners, their bodies twisted in unnatural ways. Some had clawed at the stone walls until their fingers were worn to the bone. Their skulls were tilted back, mouths open in silent screams. It was as if they had died trying to escape something, or someone. We pressed on, driven by equal parts curiosity and dread, until we reached the central chamber. At its heart stood a massive stone altar, surrounded by the remains of what had once been towering pillars. On the altar lay a body, not a skeleton, but a body, perfectly preserved as though it had just died. Its eyes were open, black and empty, staring straight at us. Malik was the first to approach, his trembling hands reaching for the golden amulet that hung around the figure's neck. The moment he touched it, the air grew thick and heavy, the whispers rising to a deafening roar. The city came alive. The walls began to shift, the carvings of twisted figures moving, their elongated limbs reaching out of the stone. The floor trembled, and sand poured through cracks in the ceiling, filling the chamber with an unnatural speed. Malik screamed, the amulet burning into his flesh, his body convulsing as though something was being pulled from him. We ran. The sand chased us, a living, writhing tide that swallowed everything in its path. I could hear the others behind me, their screams cutting off one by one as the whispers grew louder, laughing now. I don't know how I made it out, but when I stumbled into the sunlight, the city was gone. The dunes had reclaimed it, leaving no trace of what we had found. I was the only one left. Now, I wander the desert, haunted by the whispers. They're always with me, day and night, promising that I'll return to the city beneath the sands. They say it's waiting for me, that it's part of me now, and deep down, I know they're right. Story by Anonymous, The Sun God's Curse. We weren't the first team of archaeologists to seek out the forgotten temple buried beneath the desert sands, but we were the first to find it. Or so we thought. Its golden spire barely peeked through the dunes when we arrived, its once majestic entrance buried under centuries of shifting sands. They said it was a temple to the sun god, a deity so ancient his name had been lost to time. The locals called him the Scorcher, a god who punished the arrogant by turning their bones to ash beneath the unrelenting sun. But to us, it was just another story, another dig, another chance to make history. The first sign that something was wrong came when we unearthed the entrance. The air that escaped was searing, dry, and smelled of something ancient. like burnt incense and charred flesh. But we pressed on, our excitement outweighing our fear. Inside, the walls were covered with carvings of a figure with a radiant head, surrounded by kneeling figures. The deeper we went, the hotter it became. By the second day, strange things began to happen. One of our workers, Kamal, claimed he saw a shadow move on the wall, a shadow with no source. Another swore the carving's eyes followed him as he walked. We laughed it off, blamed the oppressive heat and our own overworked imaginations. But then came the light. It started as a faint glow deep within the temple, at the far end of a corridor we hadn't yet explored. At first, we thought it was a trick of the sun leaking through some unseen crack, but when we reached it, we found no such opening. The light was coming from within the walls themselves, pulsing faintly, like the beating of a heart. That night, the first of us vanished. Zaid, our lead on excavation, didn't return to his tent. We searched the camp and the temple for hours, calling his name, but found no trace. His tools were left exactly where he'd been working, but it was as though he'd been plucked from existence. The others wanted to leave, but I couldn't. I told myself it was the heat playing tricks, that Zaid had wandered off and would return. Deep down, though, I felt the truth. The sun god didn't want us there. The following day, the heat became unbearable. It wasn't just the desert's sweltering sun. The very air seemed to shimmer and distort around us. Our water supplies evaporated faster than we could explain, and the light within the temple grew brighter, hotter, burning our skin even at a distance. We were no longer alone. Shadows danced on the walls, their movements slow and deliberate, taunting us. At first, they were only in the temple, but by nightfall, they'd crept into our camp. I saw one stretch across the sand, reaching toward my tent, long fingers curling like smoke. When I shone my flashlight on it, there was nothing there. But the light didn't stop it. Miriam was the next to go. She had been sketching the carvings when she screamed, a sharp, piercing sound that made my blood run cold. By the time we reached her, she was gone, her tools scattered across the sand. But etched into the wall where she had been working was her shadow, her face frozen in an expression of sheer terror. We tried to leave after that, but the desert wouldn't let us. The sand shifted beneath our feet, forming dunes where there had been none. The blazing sun seemed to hover directly above us, unmoving, unrelenting. By the time we realized we were walking in circles, it was too late. The whispers had begun. Kneel, worship, burn. The shadows closed in that night, moving faster now, hungrier. They didn't wait for us to stray. They came into the tents, their scorching heat igniting the fabric as we fled. I ran into the temple, thinking its stone walls would protect me. Instead, I found the source of the light. It was a pedestal, glowing white-hot, with a golden mask resting atop it. The mask was the face of the sun god, its eyes empty, its mouth twisted in an eternal scream. The heat radiating from it was so intense, I felt my skin blister as I stood there. But I couldn't move. The whispers surrounded me, deafening now. Take it. Worship me. Burn for me. My hand reached out, not of my own will, and as my fingers brushed the mask, the light engulfed me. I woke up alone, half buried in the sand, the temple gone as though it had never been there. My skin is scorched, my veins filled with fire. The sun burns hotter on me than on anyone else. I cannot escape it, no matter where I go. And at night, when I close my eyes, I hear the whispers again. Kneel, worship, burn. Story by Nevermind the Sandwraith. They said the desert had a guardian, a creature made of sand, born from the storms, that hunted those who dared disturb its sacred grounds. I didn't believe it, of course. Who would? Legends are just that. Stories told to scare off fools like me. Fools who never listen. We were treasure hunters, 7 of us in total, armed with shovels, maps, and too much ambition. We'd followed rumors of an ancient tomb hidden beneath the dunes, its treasures untouched by time. The locals called it the Cursed Dune, and warned us to stay away. They said no one who dug there ever returned. We laughed, handed over some extra cash, and set off at sunrise. The first few days were uneventful, save for the heat. We followed the map to a remote stretch of sand, Where the dunes seemed taller, their slopes sharper, the grains finer. The desert here felt alive, as though it watched us with an unseen gaze. Still, we didn't let it stop us. By the third day, we'd found the tomb's entrance. It wasn't much to look at, a stone slab buried beneath layers of sand. But as we dug it free, the air changed. The wind died completely, and the heat pressed down on us like a heavy hand. Then came the sound, faint but unmistakable. A low, hollow moan, rising from the earth itself. Probably just air escaping, Harris said, though his voice wavered. We pushed on, prying the stone loose to reveal a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Excitement outweighed fear as we lit our torches and climbed down, the walls closing in around us. At the bottom, we found it, a burial chamber, its walls covered in faded carvings, and in the center, a massive stone sarcophagus. We thought we'd struck gold, literally. The carvings spoke of an ancient ruler who controlled the sun, a deity among mortals. His treasures, said to be bound to his spirit, would make kings of those who found them. We didn't think twice. We broke the seal. The second the lid slid open, the ground above us rumbled. Sand poured through cracks in the ceiling, and that low moan returned, louder, deeper, as though the tomb itself was screaming. Then the torches blew out, and the darkness swallowed us. I don't know how long we fumbled in the pitch black, but when the world stopped shaking, I heard someone sobbing. It was Mila. She'd found her torch and managed to relight it. In its dim glow, we saw Harris first, or what was left of him. His body was slumped against the sarcophagus, his face frozen in a grimace of pure terror. His skin was gray, cracked like dried mud, and his hands, dear God, his hands, were nothing but sand spilling onto the floor. We backed away, too stunned to speak. That's when we heard it, a whisper, soft at first, but growing louder, closer. We turned toward the staircase, and there it was, the Wraith. It wasn't a creature, not really. It was the sand itself, rising in a human shape, its edges swirling like a storm. Its eyes were twin orbs of burning light, and as it moved toward us, its body collapsed and reformed with every step. It wasn't walking, it was gliding. Harris had disturbed its peace. Now it was here to punish us all. We ran. Mila tripped on the stairs, and when I turned back to help her, she was already gone. Not dead, worse. The Wraith had reached her. Its shifting hand pressed to her chest, and she was turning into sand, her skin dissolving grain by grain. Her scream echoed long after her body crumbled. Outside, the storm had begun. The dunes shifted violently, swallowing our tracks, turning the landscape into an endless, chaotic sea. 2 more of us disappeared in the chaos, the Wraith's whispers growing louder with each loss. By the time I reached the camp, I was alone. The tents were gone, buried beneath the dunes, and the storm raged around me, blinding and deafening. I couldn't see it, but I knew the Wraith was there, circling, waiting. It didn't kill me. Not yet. Instead, it left me here, wandering the desert, cursed to carry its whispers in my mind. They never stop, never fade. They tell me to return, to dig again, to set it free completely. The sand is in my blood now. My veins feel gritty, my breath heavy with dust. I know I won't last much longer, but I can't stop moving. Because every time I pause, I can feel it behind me, watching, waiting, whispering. Story by Twins: The Vanishing Caravan. We had heard the stories, of course. Tales passed down through the locals about the caravan that vanished in the Sahara 50 years ago. 20 men, their camels, and every trace of their journey gone without explanation. They were warned not to stray into the forbidden dunes, and when they did, the desert swallowed them whole. We didn't believe it, of course. Or rather, we didn't want to. We were adventurers, thrill-seekers, searching for the thrill of uncovering mysteries buried beneath time. So we hired guides, loaded our camels, and headed straight into the dunes the locals warned us to avoid. The first week was uneventful. The heat was merciless during the day, the cold cruel at night, but we were prepared. The desert seemed indifferent to our presence, the endless dunes stretching into the horizon, shapeless and vast. It wasn't until the 12th day that we found it. Or rather, it found us. At first, we thought it was a mirage. In the distance, shimmering like a cruel trick of the sun, was what looked like a line of ancient wagons. As we approached, the air grew unnaturally still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. There, half buried in the sand, was the caravan. The wagons were perfectly preserved, as if they had been abandoned yesterday. The leather straps, the wooden wheels, the chests of spices and silks, all untouched by time. Yet there was something deeply wrong. The air smelled faintly of rot, a scent carried on a breeze that didn't seem to exist. And then there were the remains. The first body we found was slumped against a wagon wheel, its hands gripping the wood so tightly that its fingers had splintered into the grain. The skeleton was intact, except for the face. The skull was frozen in a silent scream, its jaw unhinged, as if its last moments had been filled with terror. Around it, the others were the same. Some clutching each other, others sprawled in the sand, but every single one of them screaming. Petrified mid-scream, Mila whispered, her voice trembling. What could have done this? I didn't have an answer. None of us did. But the desert didn't wait for us to find one. The sun sank quickly that day, faster than seemed natural, and as it disappeared, the whispers began. At first, it was faint, like a distant echo, words we couldn't quite understand, carried on the wind. Then they grew louder, surrounding us, coming from every direction. They weren't words in any language I knew, but I could feel their meaning, crawling into my skull like an invasive thought. You don't belong here. Panic set in. Our guide, Ahmed, pleaded with us to leave the cursed place. He begged us to abandon the treasure and return to the safety of the dunes. But greed is a powerful thing, and curiosity even more so. We camped there, telling ourselves the whispers were just tricks of the wind. That night, the desert came alive. I woke to screaming, but it wasn't the whispers this time. It was Mila. She was standing in the middle of the camp, her hands clawing at her ears as blood trickled down her neck. "Do you hear it?" she shrieked. "They're here." The sand around her began to move. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I saw them. Figures rising from the dunes, their bodies made of sand, their faces shifting and fluid. They weren't human. They were something else, something the desert had created, or something the desert had consumed. We ran. There was nothing else to do. Ahmed was the first to go, swallowed by the dunes as they rose beneath his feet. Mila and I made it to the edge of the caravan before she fell. I looked back, just once, and saw the sand figures closing in on her, their hands reaching out, their whispers turning into a deafening roar. By some cruel miracle, I survived. I don't know how far I ran, or how long. When I finally collapsed, the sun was rising, and the dunes around me were still again. But I could still hear the whispers, faint and mocking, promising I would never truly leave. Now, I can feel the sand in my lungs, the grit in my veins. I know the desert is patient, and one day, it will take me too. It always does.